The Fall of Empires. Why America is following Rome's exact playbook. Picture this. It's 476 AD. The last Roman emperor, a teenager named Romulus Augustulus, is deposed by a Germanic chieftain. The Western Roman Empire, which has ruled the Mediterranean for over 1,000 years, ceases to exist. Not because of a single battle, not because of one catastrophic defeat. The empire died slowly, piece by piece, system by system, over centuries. And here's what nobody teaches in history class. Rome didn't fall because of barbarians. Rome fell because it went bankrupt. The military collapsed because soldiers weren't paid. Soldiers weren't paid because the treasury was empty. The treasury was empty because tax collection broke down. Tax collection broke down because the currency was worthless. The currency was worthless because Rome debased its money for 300 years to pay for wars it couldn't afford and entitlements it couldn't sustain. Sound familiar? Now picture this. It's 2025. The United States, the global superpower for 80 years, is following the exact same pattern. The national debt is $34 trillion and growing $1 trillion every 100 days. The dollar is being weaponized so aggressively that the world is actively building alternatives. Military spending consumes resources while infrastructure crumbles. The country is politically divided between urban elites and rural populations who despise each other. Borders are porous, enemies are circling, and here's the most terrifying part. The Roman Empire didn't see it coming either. For 200 years, from Marcus Aurelius to the final collapse, Romans thought their empire was eternal, right up until the moment it wasn't. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And right now, America and Rome are rhyming so perfectly, it's like reading the same script with different actors. This isn't political commentary. This is pattern recognition. Welcome to the Fall of Empires. The economic, military, and political parallels between Rome's collapse and America's trajectory. And the question historians will ask in 200 years, did America see the warning signs, or did they ignore them just like Rome did? 1. The currency collapse, when money becomes worthless. Let me take you back to Rome, year 64 AD. Emperor Nero needs money. Wars are expensive. The population expects free grain. Gladiator games aren't cheap, but the treasury is running low on silver. So Nero does something clever. He orders the mint to reduce the silver content of Roman coins. Instead of pure silver, coins are now 90% silver, 10% base metal. Nobody notices. The coins look the same, they spend the same, but there's 10% less real value in each one. This is called debasement, and once it starts, it never stops. By 100 AD, silver content is down to 85%. By 200 AD, it's 50%. By 270 AD, barely 200 years after Nero, Roman coins contain less than 5% silver. They're basically worthless metal with a government stamp. And when money becomes worthless, everything breaks. What happened when Roman currency collapsed? Prices exploded. In 200 AD, a pound of gold could buy 50,000 pounds of wheat. By 350 AD, that same pound of gold bought 2 billion pounds of wheat. Not because gold became more valuable, because wheat became worthless to price in Roman coins. Merchants stopped accepting Roman money. Soldiers demanded payment in gold or goods, not coins. The economy reverted to barter. Tax collection failed. When currency is worthless, how do you collect taxes? You can't. People paid in goods, grain, animals, labor. But that's inefficient. The government couldn't fund the military, maintain roads, or pay bureaucrats. The state apparatus began to crumble. The military weakened. Roman legions were the best paid, best trained soldiers in the world. But when their pay became worthless, they stopped being loyal. Legions started electing their own emperors and demanding land and loot instead of wages. Rome had 50 emperors in 50 years during the crisis of the 3rd century. Most were assassinated by their own troops. Why did this happen? Because Rome was fighting wars on every frontier simultaneously. Germania, Persia, Britain, North Africa. Each war required soldiers. Soldiers required pay. But Rome's economy couldn't generate enough tax revenue to fund all of it. So they printed money, or the ancient equivalent, debased the coinage. And like all governments that print money to solve fiscal crises, they destroyed their own currency. Therefore, currency collapse wasn't a symptom of Rome's fall, it was the cause. Once money failed, everything else, military, taxes, trade, governance, failed with it. 2. The American parallel, the dollar's slow debasement. Now let's fast forward to the United States. Year 1971. President Richard Nixon faces a problem. The Vietnam War is expensive. Social programs are expanding. The Treasury is running out of gold. Under the Bretton Woods system established in 1944, the US dollar is backed by gold. Every dollar is theoretically redeemable for 1/35 of an ounce of gold. But by 1971, there are far more dollars in circulation than there is gold in Fort Knox. Foreign governments, especially France, are demanding their gold back. So Nixon does something that changes the global economy forever. On August 15, 1971, he announces, the United States will no longer convert dollars to gold. The gold window closes. The dollar becomes a fiat currency, money backed by nothing but government decree and trust. And just like Rome, once you untether money from something scarce and real, the debasement begins. The numbers don't lie. 1971, U.S. money supply, M2, equals $600 billion. 2024, U.S. money supply, M2, equals $21 trillion. That's a 3,400% increase in the money supply in 53 years. Or look at it another way. What $1 bought in 1971 requires $7.60 today. The dollar has lost 87% of its purchasing power since Nixon closed the gold window. This is debasement. Not with silver content in coins, with printing presses. Then with digital ledgers. The method changed. The outcome is the same. Why did this happen? Same reason as Rome. Wars and entitlements the country couldn't afford. Vietnam War, 1970s. Cold War military spending, 1980s. Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan, 1990s to 2020s. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid expansion, ongoing. COVID stimulus, $5 trillion printed in 2 years. Every time the government needed money it didn't have, it printed more, or borrowed, or both. And now the bill is coming due. The current situation, national debt, $34 trillion, 120% of GDP. Annual deficit, $2 trillion, adding to debt every year. Interest payments on debt, $1.1 trillion per year, soon to exceed defense spending. Unfunded liabilities, Social Security, Medicare, $200+ trillion. The U.S. is on the same path Rome was, debasing currency to pay for obligations it can't afford. And just like Rome, the consequences are starting to appear. Therefore, the dollar is being debased, not as obviously as Roman coins, but just as inevitably. And when the world loses faith in the dollar, the same collapse sequence that destroyed Rome will begin here. 3. The overextended military, defending borders you can't afford. Rome, at its height, defended a frontier stretching 5,000 kilometers, from Britain to the Middle East, from the Rhine River to the Sahara Desert. To hold this line, Rome needed 450,000 professional soldiers, spread across dozens of legions, stationed in hundreds of forts, supplied by logistics networks that spanned continents. This was manageable when Rome's economy was strong, but by the 3rd century AD, maintaining this military became impossible. The Roman military collapse. The borders became porous. Rome could no longer afford to station enough troops on every frontier. Germanic tribes began crossing the Rhine and Danube freely. Persians raided the eastern provinces. Picts attacked Britain. Barbarians were hired to defend against barbarians. Rome started recruiting foederati, barbarian tribes given land and money to defend Roman territory. This worked temporarily, but it meant the Roman military was increasingly non-Roman. Loyalty shifted from the emperor to tribal chieftains. Civil wars consumed resources. With the currency collapsing and soldiers unpaid, legions fought each other for control. The army that was supposed to defend the empire spent decades fighting itself. By 410 AD, when Visigoths sacked Rome, the city had almost no defenders. Not because Rome lacked soldiers, but because the soldiers were busy elsewhere, fighting each other or guarding wealthier provinces that could still pay them. Why did this happen? Because Rome tried to defend an empire larger than its economy could sustain. The cost of garrisoning every frontier exceeded the tax revenue generated by the provinces being defended. Therefore, Rome's military didn't collapse because of better enemies. It collapsed because Rome couldn't afford it anymore. 4. The American parallel, 750 military bases and counting. The United States maintains approximately 750 military bases in 80 countries around the world. Not 750 soldiers, 750 bases, entire installations, with runways, barracks, equipment, and personnel. The U.S. military has 11 aircraft carrier strike groups, each cost $6 to $7 billion. Troops stationed in Germany, Japan, South Korea, Iraq, Syria, Poland, and dozens of other countries. Commitments to defend NATO, 30 countries, Japan, South Korea, Australia, Israel, and more. Active military operations in multiple theaters simultaneously. The cost: U.S. defense spending in 2024, $877 billion, official budget. Add in Veterans Affairs, $300 billion. Intelligence agencies, $100+ billion. Nuclear weapons, Department of Energy, $50+ billion. Total real military spending, approximately $1.3 trillion per year. That's 40% of global military spending. The U.S. spends more on defense than the next 10 countries combined. And just like Rome, it's becoming unaffordable. The signs of overextension. Recruitment crisis. The U.S. military is missing recruitment targets by 25%. The Army fell short by 15,000 soldiers in 2023. Why? Because fewer young Americans are willing to serve. And the ones who are willing can't pass physical or mental health screenings. Equipment aging. The B-52 bomber fleet is 70 years old. Many are older than the pilots flying them. The same planes that flew in Vietnam are still in service. Why? Because replacing them costs $100+ billion, money the Pentagon doesn't have. Maintenance backlog. U.S. Navy ships are spending longer in maintenance and shorter at sea. Readiness rates are declining. Why? Deferred maintenance due to budget constraints. Allies not paying. NATO's collective defense relies on the U.S. providing the majority of funding and firepower. Most NATO members spend less than 2% of GDP on defense. The U.S. spends 3.5%. America is subsidizing the defense of wealthy European nations that could defend themselves but choose not to. Therefore, the U.S. is defending a global empire with a military it can no longer afford. And just like Rome, the cracks are showing. 5. The wealth gap. When elites stop caring about the empire. In Rome's final centuries, wealth concentration reached absurd levels. By 400 AD, the top 1% owned over 50% of all land in the empire. Senators owned estates the size of small countries. They lived in luxury villas with private armies, bathhouses, and imported delicacies. Meanwhile, the common citizen, the plebeian class, was increasingly impoverished. Small farmers lost their land to wealthy landowners. Freemen became tenant farmers or serfs. The middle class disappeared. Why this destroyed Rome? Tax evasion by the rich. Wealthy landowners used political influence to avoid taxes. The tax burden fell entirely on the poor and middle class. But the poor had nothing left to tax, so tax revenue collapsed. Loss of civic duty. In the early Roman Republic, wealthy citizens saw military service as an honor. Senators led armies. The elite paid for public works. But by the late Empire, the wealthy saw themselves as separate from Rome. They lived on estates defended by private armies. They didn't care if the frontiers fell. Their wealth was secure. Political dysfunction. The Senate became a club for the ultra-wealthy. They blocked reforms that would have stabilized the empire because those reforms threatened their wealth. Sound familiar? Why did this happen? Because once an empire stops expanding, wealth stops trickling down. Rome's economy was built on conquest, new land, new slaves, new resources. When expansion stopped, around 100 AD, the economy stagnated. Wealth pooled at the top and stayed there. Therefore, Rome didn't fall because the poor rebelled. It fell because the rich stopped caring whether the empire survived. 6. The American parallel: billionaires, bunkers, and escape plans. The United States has levels of wealth inequality not seen since the Gilded Age, or Rome. The top 1% owns 32% of all wealth in America. The top 10% owns 77%. The bottom 50% owns 2%. And unlike in previous eras, the ultra-wealthy are increasingly disconnected from the country. The new feudalism, tax avoidance at scale. Amazon paid $0 in federal income tax in 2018, despite $11 billion in profit. Billionaires like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk pay lower effective tax rates than middle-class workers by taking income as stock options and borrowing against assets. Private security replacing public institutions. Wealthy Americans are hiring private security, building gated communities, and even buying citizenship in other countries as escape plans. New Zealand has seen a surge in bunker construction by American billionaires. Political capture. The wealthiest Americans spend billions on lobbying and campaign donations. They don't need to care if public schools fail, if infrastructure crumbles, or if healthcare is unaffordable. They have private alternatives for everything. Loss of shared identity. The wealthy increasingly see themselves as global citizens, not Americans. Their wealth is stored offshore. Their children go to international schools. Their loyalty is to their class, not their country. Therefore, just like Rome, America's elite are detaching from the nation. And when elites stop caring whether the empire survives, it doesn't. 7. The decline sequence: how empires actually fall. Here's what historians miss. Empires don't collapse suddenly. They decline in a predictable sequence. The Roman decline sequence, 200 to 476 AD, currency debasement to inflation to economic instability. Tax revenue collapse to government can't pay military. Military weakens, leads to borders become porous, leads to barbarian invasions. Wealth concentration leads to elite disconnection, leads to loss of civic cohesion. Political dysfunction leads to inability to reform, leads to system lock-in. Fragmentation leads to provinces break away, leads to empire splits. Final collapse leads to last emperor deposed, leads to empire ceases to exist. Total time, approximately 270 years. The American trajectory, 1971 to present. Currency debasement, 1971 to present. Arrow, dollar losing purchasing power checkmark. Debt spiral, 2000 to present. Arrow, interest payments consuming budget, check. Military overextension, 2001 to present. Leads to recruitment crisis, aging equipment, check. Wealth concentration, 1980 to present. leads to elite detachment, check. Political dysfunction, 2010 to present, leads to inability to pass major reforms. Fragmentation? Not yet, but states increasingly ignoring federal authority. Collapse? Not yet, but the pattern is clear. We're currently at stage 5 of a 7-stage collapse. Therefore, America isn't going to collapse tomorrow. Rome didn't either, but the trajectory is set. And unless something fundamental changes, the endpoint is predictable. 8. Can it be stopped? What Rome tried and why it failed. The Romans weren't stupid. They saw the problems and they tried to fix them. Emperor Diocletian's reforms, 284 to 305 AD. Price controls. Diocletian issued the edict on maximum prices, fixing the cost of goods across the empire. The goal? Stop inflation. Result? Black markets exploded. Merchants hid goods. The edict was unenforceable and quietly abandoned. Currency reform. Diocletian introduced a new gold coin, the solidus, to replace debased silver coins. Result? Worked temporarily, but the government kept debasing other coins to pay expenses. Inflation continued. Tax reform. Diocletian restructured the tax system to make it harder for elites to evade. Result? Marginally successful. But enforcement was impossible without a functioning bureaucracy, which required money Rome didn't have. Military restructuring. Diocletian split the empire into East and West, each with its own emperor and military. Result: this actually worked for the Eastern, Byzantine Empire, which survived another 1,000 years, but the Western Empire still collapsed. Why did reforms fail in the West? Because the problems were systemic and self-reinforcing. Fixing currency required tax revenue. Tax revenue required a functioning economy. A functioning economy required stable currency. It was a loop with no entry point. Therefore, once an empire enters terminal decline, reforms rarely work, because the system is locked into a failure mode.